Hello, dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans. We have an educational mission and we got it from Günther Steiner himself. What's it all about? I'm sure you've all heard that Andretti wants to enter Formula One as the 11th team in 2025 or 2026. The fans, and possibly you yourself, are mostly excited about that. 85% of all fans say that's a great thing. They want to see Andretti in Formula One. But in Formula One itself, a lot of people see the whole thing quite differently. All you hear all the time is that the teams have something against it, that Formula One has something against it. And Günther Steiner is of the opinion that if the fans were better informed about why all this is happening, they would no longer say that it's a great thing that Andretti is coming. We want to explain exactly why Günther Steiner is of this opinion, and then we'll see at the end whether 85% of you are still in favor. I would say Günther Steiner has a very, very different point of view as a team boss than the ordinary fan out there. First of all, what happened? Andretti has applied to the FIA as one of 4 teams to be allowed to race in Formula One from 2025, 2026 or 2027 onwards. Things are once again complicated in Formula One because on the one hand there is the FIA, the sporting authority, and on the other hand there is Liberty Media. We simply say Formula One is the commercial rights holder, but both have to agree if a newcomer is to enter Formula One. The FIA is responsible for checking whether a newcomer could do it at all, whether they have the know-how, whether they have the financial power, whether they work according to sustainable principles, and so on. The FIA has now taken a close look at all this and has said that one of the 4 applicants, namely Andretti Cadillac, is suitable for entering Formula One. At the same time, there is a certain model at play at Cadillac and Andretti. They want to run with Alpine parts. That's the plan. Everything you can buy, they want to buy from Alpine, including the engine and suspension parts, as Haas does with Ferrari, for example. So that's the FIA side of things. On the one hand, the FIA says, we want to promote the sport, we want more teams, that's good for the sport, we are the sporting authority, so that fits. And the FIA also says, we have to make it possible for teams to enter Formula One because there is an EU directive from the year 2000 that is supposed to facilitate access to motorsport, and therefore the FIA has no choice but to admit applicants who can prove that they are suitable for Formula One. So much for the Formula One side of things. Now we come to the difficult part, and before it now gets difficult and complicated and we illuminate the other side, I recommend our talk channel to you. Over there we talk exactly about the subject of Andretti. What would we do if we were the teams, if we were Formula One? Would we let Andretti into Formula One, yes or no? So at the end of this video, it's best to go over to our talk channel, watch the video there, subscribe to the channel, then you won't miss any of our videos. But now let's get this explanation started. So far, we know that 10 out of 10 teams are against Andretti joining the company. But first of all, we have to make it clear that they don't have anything against Mario and Michael Andretti, nothing against General Motors or Cadillac. No, they just have something against the idea of increasing Formula One to 11 teams. And that's a bit strange when we look at the recent history of Formula One, because Formula One teams are actually money-wasting machines or money-burning machines. A Formula One team usually costs money. The last time several teams entered Formula One was in 2010. There was a big financial crisis. The manufacturers got out of Formula One, and then F1 was happy to find some crazy people who invested their money in Formula One. At that time, there were Virgin, HRT, and Caterham, none of whom are left, and at that time we had a total of 12 teams. Then there were 3 bankruptcies. One place on the grid was able to be absorbed, which is why we got Haas in 2016, but that was the last team that dared to enter Formula One. Then there was a period in which Formula One continued to be a very complicated business model. As I'm sure you've all noticed, Force India then became Racing Point because it went bankrupt. The whole thing was taken over by Aston Martin. Sauber also had major problems time and again. A billionaire then stepped in and took over the team, Finn Rausing, and that was the only way the team could survive. The value of the teams was virtually zero, not for sale. It was very, very difficult to do anything with a team like that because you just lost money as a rule. Of course, there were always exceptions. For Mercedes, it was partly quite a good business model, even if they spent a lot of money. But since then, a lot has changed in recent years. For one, the budget cap has come into effect. That was in 2021. At first with 145 million, then with 140 million, followed by 135 million. Then there were adjustments due to inflation. At the same time, not all expenses are covered. Driver salaries, for example, or engines, leasing fees, and so on. So you can still spend a lot more money than these 140 or 135 million US dollar. Mercedes, for example, has just recently published an annual report which talks about 350 million pounds. The important thing is that it's about performance-relevant factors, excluding drivers for the moment, but what you're allowed to put into the development of the car has been capped since 2021 for the first time in the history of F1. And that was actually a huge game changer, because suddenly you could develop a car with a relatively small budget that could compete, and we're still talking about budgets of 140 million and up. Before, there was a huge difference. We had the big factory teams, Mercedes, Ferrari, Red Bull, and the like, who were shelling out huge amounts of money. And the smaller teams, they didn't have this money, they had significantly less, and therefore naturally had a huge performance disadvantage. Now they can spend more money, but this money doesn't necessarily bring performance. There are also marketing expenses and so on, and that doesn't really matter for a small racing team that just wants to be competitive. At the same time, there has recently been a huge hype in Formula One. Of course, 2021 has also played a major role in this. More and more sponsors are coming into the sport, prize money is increasing and so on, and that's why the teams' budgets have simply converged. Yes, Haas still spends significantly less than Mercedes, definitely, but performance-wise, Haas can spend more money than it used to, and Mercedes can spend significantly less than it used to. That means it's become much more interesting for a racing team, even a small one, to compete in Formula One. We have just mentioned Mercedes. They have spent 350 million pounds a year, but they also recently took in 475 million pounds. That makes a pre-tax profit of 113 million pounds. That's enormous. That was unthinkable in Formula One in the past, because you always spent the money you took in because money equaled performance. That's a simplified equation, but essentially it was like this. The money you had was invested in the car, and if you didn't have the money, well, the budget hole was plugged by some patron or manufacturer. That doesn't exist in this form now. So the small players are upgrading and becoming more and more competitive, even if we don't yet have the big upheaval in the pecking order, but you can still see that the field is much narrower than it used to be. Now let's take a look at the business model of such a team, because we've already said that if you look at it, the teams have always spent what they've earned on development. Where does the team's money come from? On the one hand, prize money, which we'll look at in a little more detail in a moment. Then, of course, sponsors, which are on the rise at the end of the day, and then there's what the patrons or the factories pump into F1. And now let's take a closer look at the prize money of a Formula One team. Where does it come from? Liberty Media, also known as F1, is the commercial rights holder, which earns a whole lot of money from Formula One. More about how that works later. 2/3 of the profits from Formula One are distributed to all the teams. Of these, let's take a simplified calculation of $1 billion US, which is distributed to all the teams together. 20% of this billion goes to teams that have been particularly successful in the last 10 years in the Constructors' World Championship, where there is a point system from constructors rank 1 to 3, with 3, 2 or 1 point awarded. In total, there is a maximum of 60 points over the 10 years. And these 20% of this billion, i.e. the 200 million, are then divided among the teams that have collected the corresponding points from these 60 points over the last 10 years. Then the remaining 80%, these are the very interesting ones that we have to take a closer look at, because these 80% are distributed among all the teams. And it's not distributed on a whim, but according to the constructors' rank in the previous season. In other words, you can simply calculate an average of 800 million by dividing our calculation example by 10 teams. Each team gets 80 million. That's a lot of money, but it looks even better for the Constructors' World Champion, who gets about 128 million US dollars. The 10th place team, on the other hand, only gets about 48 million. But that's still a lot of money, especially when you consider that you also have sponsors and you're not allowed to spend an infinite amount of money. What happens if an 11th team comes in now? The pot doesn't get any bigger. That is stipulated in the Concord Agreement. The Concord Agreement regulates the government of Formula One. It says how rule changes have to be made, who has what to say, and then various parties get involved, FIA, Formula One, and all the teams. On the one hand, the government, on the other hand, the Concord Agreement defines the distribution of money exactly. Who gets what, under what circumstances. And this pot of 2/3 of the profits, 80% as normal prize money, so to speak, does not change with an additional team. That means that up to now, in our calculation model, the teams have received an average of 80 million US dollars. If there is an 11th team, they only get 72.7 million US dollars. So roughly roundabout 7.2 or 7.3 million US dollars less per team. Of course, this affects different teams to different degrees. Of course, those at the top of the constructors' standings will lose a little more. Those who are further back lose a little less. When we signed the Concord Agreement, we already thought about what would happen if an 11th team were to join, because the existing team said, well, wait a minute, we've been around for a long time. We went through Formula One when it wasn't as lucrative. We were, you'll pardon the expression, eating shit. At that time, especially during COVID as well, we tried everything to stay with it, to somehow manage it, and now all of a sudden it becomes lucrative and then others come in. We have to find some mechanism to prevent that from happening so that the others don't spit in our soup. So they introduced an anti-dilution fee. This is a kind of anti-dilution fee that amounts to 200 million US dollars up to and including the year 2025, which is the term of the current Concordia Agreement. A new entrant has to pay this 200 million and the money is then divided among the existing 10 teams. Andretti knew that too. They assumed that you have to pay this 200 million and everything is fine. Now it's relatively easy to work out. 200 million over 10 teams means 20 million per team. And you heard earlier, on average you lose about a little over 7 million. That means that after 3 years, that's almost used up again, on average. Now, of course, there's a lot of talk about what to do with the Concord Agreements from 2026 onwards, and there's one sum that's been floating around all the time, 600 million US dollars. This means that 600 million is to be bought in. Now it's 200 million, possibly 600 million. That would be 60 million per team. That would be about 8.3 years, which could be compensated with less prize money. One or two team bosses say, wait a minute, we can start talking at 100 million per team. Why? Because 100 million, that would sort of mean you'd have to raise $1 billion as a new entrant. $1 billion is about what a team is worth today. You can see that, for example, in the shares that were sold at Renault or Alpine. There, the value of the team is estimated at about $1 billion. And why should it be cheaper to enter Formula One as a newcomer than to buy an existing team? That doesn't make sense for many people, and that's why they came up with these 100 million, 1 billion that you have to pay to buy in. Of course, then there's also the money you need to build up the team in the first place. So of course the team bosses' calculations are a bit off, but of course they want money. At the same time, I've already told you, the income is getting a bit less with the prize money. Maybe you could lose sponsors if you have more competition, but at the same time, of course, the value of your own team goes down if there's more. Now it's a franchise. There are only 10 of them. If there's an 11th team coming in, well, then you can assume that your own team is worth a little less. We see it now. For example, Aston Martin is apparently thinking about it, or the consortium around Lawrence Stroll is apparently thinking about selling the team. There is said to be interest from Saudi Arabia. But if Saudi Arabia had the opportunity to set up its own team and thus enter Formula One, then there would be an alternative offer that might be cheaper than buying the team. And that's why the teams are saying, wait a minute, on the one hand, we're getting less money, and on the other hand, our teams are becoming worth less. That's why we don't want that. That's the side of the teams. I think you can understand that now. But then Formula One comes in, and now it gets really interesting because the teams have nothing to say in the whole process. They have signed this Concord Agreement. It says so in there, and now it's up to Formula One. Now you can say, well, the FIA has granted the entry license. Formula One then actually has nothing more to say. That's a very, very interesting question, and unfortunately we can't answer it here because no one can at the moment. All they say is that you also need a commercial agreement to be able to race in Formula One. That was different in the past when there were disputes and people threatened that if Bernie didn't present the commercial agreement, they wouldn't be allowed to show the cars on TV and so on. That's no longer possible. You need this commercial agreement. But if Formula One doesn't give someone a commercial agreement that they can sign, what are they going to do? That's where the cat bites the tail. So It's a difficult thing, but in the end, Formula One has to decide whether they want an 11th team, yes or no. And now you've also heard that Liberty Media is not particularly positive about Andretti and the new team. Why is that? I explained to you earlier that the prize money pot doesn't grow with an 11th team that stays. This means that Formula One would not have any additional expenses for the time being. But, as I've already said, the Concord agreement expires at the end of the year, then 2026 will come, and as I said, the entire distribution of money will be settled. And you can safely assume that the teams will want more money from Liberty Media, a larger share of the profits, if they say, well, now we have to divide it by 11. So that's a negotiating position of the teams. Of course, they tend to want more and more from year to year or from Concord agreement to Concord agreement, but that would, of course, give them a very, very good argument. But Formula One would actually benefit from an additional team, right? Because more teams, more action, more money. Let's now take a look at the business model of Formula One, i.e. the commercial rights holder. How do these revenues come about in the first place, and the high profits? Well, essentially there are three pillars. There is some more as well, but we don't need to take a closer look at that. TV money, sponsors, so series sponsors and track fees. So that means what, for example, Silverstone, Qatar, or whatever promoter pays for Formula One to come. So TV stations, let's take a look at those. There's one more team. The TV station says, yeah, fits, I'll pay you more money now. Well, probably not at first, because simply having an additional team doesn't mean that the TV station can turn up the subscription prices or immediately increase advertising revenues. Let's look at the series sponsors. Just an additional team, do you want to spend more money for being on the sidelines? First and foremost, no. I don't have any more of it. My logo has been in the picture just as long as before. Why should I spend more money now? Race promoters, an additional team, yes, maybe a little more action. Do I sell more tickets because of that? I'm sold out anyway, so can I make the ticket more expensive just because there's now one more team? Probably not. So do I give Formula One more money because there are now more teams racing? Probably not. On the contrary, some of the race promoters are having problems because they wouldn't be able to accommodate the team's safety concerns. You've heard it all. Of course, on circuits like Monaco, for example, space is really, really tight. So you'd have to find solutions. You'd also have to take structural measures, and that costs money. Who will take care of that? Formula One doesn't want to take it on. The track operator says, well, that's not our business. So I'm of the opinion that if the FIA says in the regulations that there are theoretically even 26 cars, or at least 24, then a track must also be designed so that they can theoretically accommodate all these teams. But as you can see, there is no more money for Formula One per se. There is only more money if the sport grows, and you have to look at how the sport grows as a result of this additional team. Now, it's a very interesting constellation. Andretti is not just anyone. It's a name in motorsport history. It's an American team, and the American market is very interesting. And now Formula One has to ask itself the question, is the sport growing more through this additional team than it would normally? That's a very difficult analysis, but that's what Formula One is currently doing, examining what this team really brings us. How many paddock tickets, for example, does the manufacturer General Motors buy? In the case of paddock tickets, Formula One is making money, which is then partly distributed to the teams. They are now checking everything very carefully. What are the costs for the tracks? What is the additional income from sponsorship and possibly also from a manufacturer? They also buy sponsorship space. How many paddock tickets do they buy? And does the sport grow so much due to an additional manufacturer, an additional team, that it outweighs or even exceeds the other things? So it's complicated. You see that already. Formula One says they need time to analyze the whole thing, and that's a very interesting point. Why does Formula One say it takes time? Maybe the analyses really do take so long. Or maybe they want to make sure that Andretti can't get on board in 2025, that it's too tight, that they have to get on board in 2026, and then the anti-dilution fee goes up. But that's not the end of the story. The EU may object to such a high anti-dilution fee. I mentioned the directive earlier. There are also political aspects in addition to all the commercial aspects. So you see, I think we have now outlined the basic problem. I hope we've fulfilled Günther Steiner's educational mandate. You're well informed and can now form your own opinion, and I'm really curious to see whether you might have a slightly different view of the subject after watching the video. We have discussed the whole thing. I would be happy if you visit our other channel, and we have just said it, the whole thing will still drag on, but we will keep you up to date on our website, www.motorsport-magazin.com. That sounds old-fashioned, no problem. Of course, we also have an app. It's free for Android and iOS. Just search for Motorsport Magazine in the appropriate Play Store or App Stores.